Well, hello to everyone. This is Ray Parrish again, and here with the Spirit of Truth, and just an amazing group. Very thankful to them, and Chris, and everyone. And today I want to talk about the Declaration of Independence and the ideals of the Declaration. And right away, I'll just say this: the word equal is, we use that a lot, and I would just say most people don't really understand that word, but there it is. And so going into the Declaration of Independence and understanding its ideals, I'd like to make that the topic for today. My first question I always ask my students, or a question about the Declaration. By the way, it doesn't count as a grade at all, but I'll have this as hey, it's a multiple choice. Folks, who wrote the Declaration of Independence? And I will give them, of course, Thomas Jefferson, the Committee of Five. Is it Franklin, Adams, and Jefferson together? Is it Continental Congress? And I put in God. I put God there. And I'll just say this: God gets a few votes, but for the most part, it is Thomas Jefferson who is seen as the person that wrote the Declaration of Independence. And while writing it down, and I'll try to tell them this, the ideals, there's one thing about just writing stuff down, but the ideals of the Declaration of Independence, and you will see the impact of God in there, that I think today, for the most part, that idea is ignored in the public school system. First item I'd like to talk about with the Declaration are the three branches of government. And I know you're thinking, Parrish, is the Declaration, not the Constitution. We'll try to get to the Constitution, but in the Declaration, you start to see the three branches of government. And I want you to see these quotes that come out of the Declaration. First of all, looking at the Declaration and how we see God coming out of this, one thing you will see is the quote, "The laws of nature and nature's God." Another, you will see protection of divine providence. And another one, you will see supreme judge of the world. If you look at that, what you've got, laws of nature, nature's God, well, that sounds like Congress, Article 1 of the legislative branch in the Constitution. Protection of divine providence, well, Article 2 is the president and the executive branch of the Constitution. The supreme judge of the world sounds like, of course, the Supreme Court in Article 3 and the judicial branch. So, with the laws of nature, nature's God, protection of divine providence, supreme judge of the world, we see the three branches of government emerging, by the way, with God as the centerpiece. By the way, when it says endowed by Creator with certain unalienable rights, well, there you have the Bill of Rights. And most Americans are pretty clueless about the Constitution in many ways, but the Bill of Rights, that's an area that Americans see. Now, if we could, I want to tie the three branch idea that we see in the Declaration, see in the Constitution, and I want to put this into the Old Testament, Isaiah 33:22. And there, of course, you can see where it talks about the Lord is our lawgiver, our king, and our judge. And so this idea that three branches are somehow born by John Locke, born by Americans, this goes way back into the realm of Isaiah. And our class, back when we had a We the People team, this was a great student who came up with this idea. When we think of legislative branch, executive branch, and judicial branch, we would talk about this in our class, about the idea of humans. It's kind of like three parts of people: mind, body, and soul. And the idea of the mind, well, it's kind of like Congress, which can be very scattered, but the mind is where the ideas are. And then, of course, it's the executive that's supposed to make those laws work. Well, that's the body. And we in my class we loved exploring the Supreme Court. And I always enjoyed looking at the Supreme Court. But the idea of that is being the soul of America. And so this idea of mind, body, and soul, along with the three branches of government, along with the book of Isaiah, these are items, once again, just give them a chance in the realm of public education. Because a lot of people would just say, well, Thomas Jefferson, he wrote the Declaration of Independence. And oh, by the way, he's a slaveholder. So why should we even acknowledge that he's anything special? And I hope he would say that when he says self-evident truth. Remember, I hope I told you, he wanted it to say sacred and undeniable. But Ben Franklin comes in and says, you sound like a preacher. So let's just say it's the self-evident truth. And so I remember being in a kind of a group, me, a high school teacher with some college professors, and we were talking to some kids. And I was just saying something nice about the Founding Fathers. And another teacher, a professor, she comes in and says, you mean you're saying nice things about a bunch of slaveholders? And I understood that, and I backed away. And what I wish I had done is saying, well, that's not their idea. They couldn't live up to their own ideal, and I think they would admit that. This is from a higher power. This is from God, is where the real truth comes from. Okay, the second item to discuss is, of course, the word equal. And we hold these truths to be self-evident or sacred and undeniable, that all men are created equal. And I think that's got to be something that we constantly talk about in the classroom. We do that in the public school. We want to try to make sure that idea of, hey, we've got to treat people equally. And yet, how do you do that? Grade-wise, people aren't equal. Wealth-wise, IQ. There's so many levels, of course, where, hey, people are not equal, and yet there it is. So what does that mean? And I would just love to tell our students, and I try to, the idea of equality through the eyes of God, our Creator, and we're made in the image of God. And so therefore, that we have this choice, and God is not some bully who's trying to say, hey, here's what I think. It's kind of an open realm, says you're equal in my eyes. I don't see you in all these different layers if you come to me. If you want to be your own leader and your own king, then of course you are going to create layers and define people as not equal. Every culture I've ever known in history, that's what they do, unless they are strongly attached to the idea that equal really comes from, Jesus himself is a guy who went looking for just the lowlife of people who just couldn't, life was horrible for them. And so that idea of equal within the Declaration of Independence should just be a big time thing we talk about over and over again, and not try to go through human psychology, which, okay, fine, all of those philosophy, those are things we need to study. But at some point, we've got to come to our mark. I think I mentioned this before. What sin originally meant was off the mark. And so what exactly is our mark when we're trying to define sinfulness, when we're trying to define the word equal? What exactly is the mark that we use to try to get that? And third, I want to talk about another very famous part of the Declaration of Independence, and that is life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, which, by the way, endowed by the Creator, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And if we could edit that into what it looks like in the 5th and the 14th Amendments of the Constitution, it is life, liberty, and property. I think Thomas Jefferson thought pursuit of happiness just sounded more interesting, more in depth. And honestly, pursuit of happiness doesn't just mean having fun, it means to pursue your path in life. But right away, America has been in this realm of, so how do you define life? How do you define liberty? How do you define property or your pursuit of happiness? And I'll just give you, of course, two cases here on that. In 1857, the Dred Scott case. This is where the Supreme Court, led by Roger Taney, the Chief Justice, decided that when we're looking at the Fifth Amendment and life, liberty, and property, the slave actually is the property of the master. And it's really the minority right of the master to own a slave who was property. And it's not about the life and the liberty of Dred Scott. And by the way, this case is what started Abraham Lincoln. Because of that case, he came back into politics. The other big case is, of course, Roe versus Wade, 1973. Because in Roe versus Wade, the whole idea, who are the people? Well, life, liberty, property. And the 14th Amendment was used here to say, well, the fetus, it's the property of the mom. And its life is no. Liberty. No, it's liberty of the mom, not liberty of the fetus. So you see the battle going on between life, liberty, property, or life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. And that is why, to pay attention to our Supreme Court, they've had that same dilemma of trying to understand exactly what is meant by life and liberty and property. And by the way, just real quick to talk about the word equal again, the U.S. Supreme Court realizes people are not equal all the time. That certain laws, there can't be a law that says everybody is equal. And so they have basically 3 levels. I don't want to go into too much depth, but strict scrutiny, intermediate scrutiny, and rational basis. And rational basis is like, well, as far as age and wealth, yes, we can have laws that they're not equal. I won't get into too much depth of that, but even the Supreme Court has tried to figure out, so what does equal mean in a society where people ain't equal? And yet there it is in our 14th Amendment and, of course, in the Declaration. And, of course, looking at the Creator and looking at the word, the Creator of equal, that obviously God needs to be looked at and admired throughout that. Fourth item I want to talk about is it's the word slavery and how Thomas Jefferson was trying to blame that on the king. And members of Continental Congress said no. Partly it's really not the king's fault, and also because, look, slavery was big in the South. Also in New England, they were involved in the slave trade. And so that's what I've heard for so long, and it should be taught. Look, your founders with slaves writing this down, trying to shift blame on slavery. Well, the one thing I will say, and it was late in my career where I figured this out, once this was written, of course, 1776, the biggest anti-slavery movement in human history started to emerge. During the colonial period, slavery was legal everywhere in the 13 colonies. Starting with the Declaration, of course, this is where you see the Mason-Dixon line between Maryland and Pennsylvania. North of that, you have gradual emancipation. I know a lot of people don't like that, but that meant something usually like, hey, when this slave turns 21, or this slave born after this year, then they turn 21 or 28, they will be free. Then comes 1787, the Northwest Ordinance. And that is from Continental Congress that says what is today the Midwest, these states will become states equal to the others. And by the way, they will not be slave states. Now, by the way, there was a Southwest Ordinance from Kentucky below saying they could have slaves. But right away, you see a battle in the American Declaration of Independence that is launched is, are we a country about freedom? Or are we a country about slavery? And there were people saying, look, we can be both. Why not? There were people, especially the Quakers early on, saying no. Those two, they don't go together at all. And then there was the kind of wiggly, I just don't know. And I'll just say it's really Abraham Lincoln, as he starts out as a politician not liking slavery, but not wanting to get rid of it. So one of our great stories is, how does Lincoln become the great emancipator? And, I want to get into that at some point, because I think Abraham Lincoln, incredible journey of a man who seemed to be a bit of an atheist. And then I will leave you on suspense to talk about what many think are his last words that he spoke before the assassination on Good Friday of 1865. Fifth item I want to talk about here is Republican motherhood. And this is very interesting, because when we say all men are created equal, so we are, what about, woman means of man, but this becomes part of the issue, and the Supreme Court still deals with this. So when can we pass a law that separates men and women, like the draft? Can women be drafted? Well, the one thing back then I'll say is Republican motherhood was seen as essential for the Republic. That women had the toughest jobs on the planet, and that was, to have children and then to raise those children with a sense of honor and virtue. I remember when I was at Williamsburg, I've been several times, and I've seen this person several times, and I can't remember his real name, but he's Thomas Jefferson. He acts like he's Thomas Jefferson, and he is amazing. And I had a question to ask him. I can't remember, but he ignored me. And there was a little girl that asked him something. And it was about, of course, why did you founders not treat women well? Why couldn't they vote? Why couldn't they serve in office? And it's very interesting what he said. He said, he says, I think, honestly, women were too good for that. Politics is politics, where there's just a lot of ugh going on. But as far as being an incredible mother, the person who raises children and who is very much into the virtue and honor, that's what Republican motherhood was all about. By the way, I just got to say this, when I was in Williamsburg, it may have been that very same time. Once again, I saw there was a lady there, in a cabin, pretending like she lived, back in the 1700s. And once again, a little girl asked her, don't you wish you could vote? Don't you wish you could be involved in politics? And this woman, it was just amazing. I'll never forget her face. She just kind of went, She's like, I never even thought of that. I mean, if the men want to do politics, fine. Let them go do that stuff. And originally, the first half of U.S. history, the basis of America was not government. Government was about comfortable preservation. That's the basic thing. As far as the essence, it would be your family and your church and your community. And so the idea of where truth really came from, the family, the community, and of course the church, that was the heartbeat. It wasn't some faraway government. And certainly even the local government was not considered, they're just trying to make things peaceful. But the idea of, motherhood and Republican motherhood, and it's awesome about what our ladies and how far they have progressed. But I don't want to take away this idea of the most important job on the planet, and that is giving birth to children and raising children. And I think that is something that is a very big part of trying to understand the Declaration of Independence and the word equal. Just want to end with our founders and one of the most amazing days in American history, and what happened on July 4th, 1826, 50 years after the signing of the Declaration of Independence. And if you know this, it's amazing, because this isn't taught awful lot, but I want to put in the word miracle here. And back then people knew it. People understood this didn't just happen by accident. But what happened on that day are two men who both were credited for the Declaration of Independence, because you all know Thomas Jefferson will say, hey, he wrote it. But the guy who a lot of people thought wrote it and gave it to Thomas Jefferson was John Adams. And when you think about this, John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, we have a man from the North and we have a man from the South. And the idea that and they're the only two presidents who signed the Declaration of Independence. They went through an amazing time. They were together in the realm of the Revolution. They split apart because they had two very sort of different views of how this new government should look. But then they got back together and started writing each other again, and had, different versions of what America, the journey America was going on there. But the idea that they actually died on the same day, of course, with no knowledge that that had happened, July 4th, 1826. It was Jefferson who went first, trying to get a slave to move a pillow for him, which, by the way, one of his earliest memories was being carried on a pillow by a slave soon after he was born. This is Thomas Jefferson. About 6 hours later, of course, John Adams will also die up in New England. And he actually, at that time, several witnesses, when he died, from the upper hallway, it's like the sun came out of a cloud somehow. At least the cloud got out of the way, and this sunshine. And once again, people saw this is not some kind of natural disaster thing that happened, or some kind of weather event. That's the way we would see it. But the idea that God is showing within this, once again, I would just say the story itself, to try to understand that story and understand the Declaration of Independence and the ideals that we still live with, and just see where God is mentioned. And I've been in several workshops about this, and I will just tell you, God is usually not mentioned. This is not something, we look at the founders, and some people worship the founders, and a lot of people just hate the founders. Just get the founders away from it for a bit and just look at where this truth actually comes from. Well, thank you for listening, and thank you for coming to the Spirit of Truth. We will continue with this. I will just tell you, the Declaration is like a foundation. And for my students, I just try to keep coming back to it over and over again. We're still living under the ideals of the Declaration of Independence. And they, of course, will be used. And of course, great question was, well, how much was that used to create the Constitution? And so that is what I'd love to discuss next, is talk about the Constitutional Convention in 1787. Thank y'all so much for showing up.